Welcome to Sculpting a Life, Chana Orloff during occupation, escape, exile, return, 1938 to 1949, in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I welcome today's esteemed speaker, Paula Birnbaum, who is the inaugural and Getty Endowed Chair and Professor of Arts History and Museum Studies, and the founding director of the Museum Studies Master of Arts program at the University of San Francisco. She's a specialist in modern and contemporary art and holds a doctorate in art history from Bryn Mawr College. Birnbaum is a former Fulbright Scholar in France and fellow at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender at Stanford University. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary art in relationship to gender and sexuality, as well as institutional and social politics in museum exhibitions. She's the author of, among other works, Sculpting a Life, Chana Orloff Between Paris and Tel Aviv, Brandeis University Press 2022, Women Artists in Interwar France, Routledge in 2011 and 2016, and the co-edited anthology Essays on Women's Artistic and Cultural Contributions 1919 and 1939, published by Edwin Mellon in 2009. Paula is a regular contributor to scholarly journals and museum exhibition catalogs exploring the role of gender and sexuality in modernism. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the lovely introduction, and to the Fritz Ascher Society for inviting me to share my research with you today. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to first introduce you to the life and work of Chana Orloff before focusing in on the war years. As Rachel just explained, she's the subject of a recent biography that I published with Brandeis University Press. And I've just been fascinated by this artist for a long time. Quick origin story of my interest in her goes back to my days as a graduate student at Bryn Mawr College in the 1990s. And I was wondering, where are all the women artists? This was kind of the second generation of the feminist art movement, and there were so few women in my courses. And so I studied a group of over 100 women from the École de Paris, the School of Paris, kind of interwar period in Paris, and learned about this group called the Société des Femmes Artistes Modernes, the Society of Modern Women Artists, in which Orloff showed her work. And there were over 100 women from all over the world who exhibited together in the 1930s in Paris in different prominent galleries. And I got to know several of the children and grandchildren of these artists. And one of them was the grandchildren of Chana Orloff. And I was so struck by this story and just her resilience in face of adversity over and over again, that I thought someday I'd like to write a biography. So here we are. So I'd like to start with this image you see on the right of a small bust of Chana that she produced in 1940. And this was actually found in the 1970s in Paris at the Marché aux Puces, which is one of the largest flea markets in Paris. And it's very small. You can see it's only 17 centimeters high. And it's clearly signed C.H. Orloff, dated 1940. And it was later confirmed by the artist's family as an authentic self-portrait. And it's thought that this piece was one of many that was pillaged from her studio by the Nazis during World War II. when she lost over 100 works and many other were destroyed. So Orloff was a Jewish emigre numerous times. She was born in Ukraine in a small town outside of Mariupol, an area we've heard a lot about in the last few years. And then the family went to Palestine. Then she went to Paris. She had a forced exile, of course, during World War II to Switzerland. And finally, she returned to Paris and made frequent visits to Israel, where much of her family lived. So, as a victim and survivor of pogroms and then the Nazi atrocities, she really exemplifies the resilience of an artist in diaspora. So this piece was made during the Nazi occupation in France when French and foreign-born Jews were banned from public spaces, forced to observe a curfew, wear the yellow badge with the Star of David and the word Juif written on it. So she was professionally stifled, prohibited from selling her work, and she strategically created what she called sculpture de poche, or pocket sculptures, that were so small that they could easily fit in a coat pocket. And the idea was she knew she was going to leave and she needed ways to support herself. So by creating these small works, she could ideally sell them. And so this self-portrait bust, signed and dated, I like to think of it as emblematic of Orloff's migrant experience, with this very strong profile, stoic facial expression, and giving dignity to this nearly untenable situation. And she's 52 years old at this time, and confronting the traumatic experience of being uprooted yet again. This is where I first learned about Orloff's work. She arrived in Paris in 1910 from Palestine and became so successful and driven in 16 years, 1926. She had enough funds and status and reputation. She became a French citizen that year. She was awarded the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor for her sculptures. And she was able to take out a loan from the bank to buy a plot of land in Montparnasse. And she commissioned one of the best known French architects of the day, Auguste Perret, who had just designed the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, to design this modernist studio that you see in the image on the left, the outside with the square windows. So you see the influence of Le Corbusier. This is this moment in Paris of modernist architecture. And this is the interior of the studio as it looks today. And you can go and visit. It's a private museum run by the family. And so this is where I first discovered her work and just became fascinated. Who are all those people? These sculpted portrait busts was one of her signature forms of art making, and she would receive commissions from friends and colleagues, and they're all kind of lined up there on the wall like a bookcase, kind of looking at you. And so this is how I got to know her archives are located here, and I began my research on her. Here we see a photograph on the right taken of Orloff just before she commissioned that new studio. This is in a prior one, and this was taken by an American photojournalist, Thérèse Bonny, who photographed many artists in this period. And I chose this image for the cover of my book, just thinking about her intentional expression there, the way she hopped up on a pedestal and looks at us with such confidence and strength, and as if she's in dialogue with her own sculptural portrait of a male colleague on the right, and a Ukrainian artist named Widhoff. And again, this idea of her resilience, that she had faced forced exiles, really comes through here, I think, in the way she's positioning herself. And these are media photos that, many of these artists would stage. Her work is found all over the world. Both of these pieces, you can find different casts of them in the national museums in France and Israel. On the left, Widhoff, this is at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can find it outside, right in front of the children's section of the museum. And on the right, a piece from the Pompidou. And this is kind of her classic style that she's most well known for. On the right, you have a kind of sense of Art Deco, the geometry of the bodily forms kind of stacked up upon each other, and rounded forms. And I like to think of that piece as almost like a body folded in a yoga position. So this is kind of the most famous period of her work for which she's best known. A little bit more about her early life. As I mentioned, migration is a key theme throughout her life. The family, she was the eighth born of 9 siblings in this small town outside of Mariupol. One of the few remaining photos from this period is on the left with some of her siblings. And then they migrated to Palestine, to Petah Tikva in 1905. They came in stages. They suffered from pogroms in Ukraine, and the artist collaborated with an Israeli journalist named Rivka Katznelson to write a memoir in the first person. Katznelson was writing it. And the book was never published, but I did have access to the manuscript, and there were many stories about her early life that I drew upon. It unfortunately only covers her early life, but there were many stories about life in Ukraine and what they endured, her brother witnessing their house burning down, and just, yeah, these cycles of violence that they endured. So now she's on the right, newly arrived in Palestine and very much embodying this idea of the new Hebrew woman. She cuts her hair short. She got involved in different sporting clubs. She was studying Hebrew, and she was working as a seamstress. So her older sister was forced into an arranged marriage, and the younger sisters decided they needed to have a profession so that wouldn't happen to them. So she and her sisters all trained in a sewing school in Mariupol and were designing women's dresses. In Ukraine and then in Palestine, she was working as a seamstress, at first living with her family and then ultimately renting her own apartment in Neve Tzedek. But she became bored with this life. The story goes that she was offered a position to teach sewing at a girls' school in Jaffa and was sent to Paris to gain further training in fashion design before returning to Palestine to teach. So here she has arrived in Paris on the left. She ended up working at one of the most prestigious fashion houses of the day, the House of Paquin. And Paquin was a precursor to Coco Chanel, designing clothing for women, where you could move. And you see her appearance has changed drastically. She's the figure on the right in the photo on the left. And she was taking classes in drawing that were part of her formation in fashion. And she so excelled in the art part of the curriculum that a friend recommended she take an exam to enter the state-funded École des Arts Décoratifs. And she did so well on the exam, she actually came in second, that she entered this national art school. And you have to imagine she's this Jewish emigre woman. She barely speaks French. She talked about not fitting in as an emigre, arriving into this classical art school where they're studying, Greek and Roman art. And so she ended up kind of having two different artistic formations. One was in this training in this official school run by the French government. And the other, she started meeting other emigre artists. And on the right, you see a photo of her in it's a Russian academy run by another woman named Marie Vassiliev, who is Chana is in the center with the braids, and Marie Vassiliev is just to her left with some other friends. And this is where this is like an open studio for international artists. You hear a dozen different languages being spoken, and there's life models coming. You can get food for very inexpensively. And during World War I, Vassiliev ran it as a canteen where she had hot meals for these artists who were, struggling to survive. So this was a place where she met many of her colleagues, Chagall, Moshe Kissling, many different artists from Eastern Europe, and really started building a sense of community. And all along, she had a very strong sense of pride in her Jewish identity, much like Chagall, and made works about being Jewish. In contrast to many of the other artists I've studied from this period, were more interested in what we say passing, right? They change their names, they might convert to Catholicism, and not want to engage publicly with Jewish themes in their work or regarding their identity. So this is one of her very early pieces called The Two Jews, which no longer survives. And you see she's looking at Egyptian art, depicting these two figures in profile. And she actually sent this photograph back to her family in Palestine with an inscription on the back, Chana be'avoda, Chana at work. And you see, I write about it in my book, like, what does it mean to be a Jewish artist? What does it mean to create an image of the Jewish body or a Jewish portrait? It's almost like she's asking that of us. And now she's looking very much like the modern woman, right? She's cut her hair short. She's dressed in black. She's, really experimenting with her own self-presentation as well. And I put this against Chagall, also exploring his identity as a Jewish emigre in Paris and feeling this sense of not belonging really in any one place, right? This sense of home is always in tension, constantly feeling like you're in diaspora. I think both artists were interested in exploring what it means to be Jewish in France at this time. And this was, of course, just a few decades after the Dreyfus affair, in which Jewish captain Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason at the turn of the century. And it was a huge scandal in France. And some people, supported him, that he was innocent, and many public figures did not. And there was a lot of anti-Semitic popular imagery that circulated in the wake of this trial, which I show in the bottom there. And then on the right in Palestine, you have a whole movement to really give visual image to what they called the new Jew, right? To fight against these caricatures that were circulating in Europe of the kind of emasculated Jewish male or greedy, all the different ugly stereotypes of Jews at this time. And so Hannah is in the midst of this, trying to, create her own image and idea of what it means to be Jewish. She was very close friends with Modigliani, who you see drew a quick portrait of her in the center. It's inscribed in Hebrew. He was also Jewish from Italy. And it says Chana bat Raphael, Chana, daughter of Raphael. That's her father's name. And she was very much in dialogue with these artists. And prior to my work on her, I would see occasional references to her work as almost derivative of her male colleagues. And I present it more actively as an exchange that For example, on the left, her work of this female nude, it predates Modigliani's paintings of the nude that have a similar kind of attenuated style. And so the idea that these artists were exchanging works, this is a portrait of Chagall's young daughter with this Egyptian-like mane of hair here, I think is important to set the stage for her career. And she also was very much interested in the modern woman. This is the woman as Amazon, the woman on a horse. The photo is from a first exhibition in her studio. And this was a time that she met and fell in love with her husband, Ari Justman, who was a poet from Poland, also Jewish. And they collaborated on a journal called Seek, where he would publish poems and she would illustrate them with different representations of women and the body. On the right is an image of Judith and Holofernes, which is quite interesting the way it's fragmented and very much cubist. This was a journal published by a colleague of theirs named Albert Birot. And at the same time, Justman, you see on the bottom left, was serving in the American Red Cross as a medic and helping during the First World War. And tragically, he got the Spanish flu. So when the flu came, he was very much scared. And you can see here, I was working on this book and this chapter during our own, beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. And just looking back at what happened with the Spanish flu was just really quite illuminating. So he was basically afraid this was going to come into his house. They had a child in January of 1918. And 1 year later, they had a first birthday party for the child where they were celebrating with their friends, passing out cigars. And literally 8 days later, he was gone from the flu at age 30. So that flu really, attacked young people. So she's representing herself as a widow here in the center after losing him. And she survived by creating portraits of colleagues. She was commissioned to illustrate a book of who's who in contemporary art. And those were some of her friends. She also was involved with many Jewish artists who were coming from Palestine, as well as other parts of Eastern Europe. This is Reuven Rubin, a colleague who is now one of the best-known Jewish artists from the early 20th century, and her portrait of him. And she helped him make connections in Paris. She also was involved in the queer community in Paris. Many of her friends were also identifying as modern women artists. Natalie Barney in the center was an American expatriate writer who held a salon, and her partner Romaine Brooks on the left, also very much a new woman. The French surrealist artist and writer Claude Cahun on the right. So these are her friends and her community, and she's exploring what it means to be a modern woman, to be lesbian in these works. And at the same time, she's a new mother, and the theme of motherhood proliferates throughout her entire career. And in the book, I write about her interest in pregnancy and lactation and nursing, and just giving agency to women in their experience of motherhood and their embodiment in really powerful ways. And she posed for photographs regularly with her son that were reproduced in the press. And so, again, just like certain artists wanted to pass and not show their Jewishness, many of the women I've studied were mothers, and they didn't want to emphasize that. They wanted to show their professional, serious identity and separate motherhood from that. But she really incorporated it into her identity. So this kind of walks you to the place where she's so successful. She builds her own studio. A first monograph is published about her on the left, and you see her self-portrait on the cover there. Her friends are quite international. This is a couple she was very close with. Otto Rank was a famous psychoanalyst, and his wife Beata Rank. He was from the Freudian school in Vienna and then split from Freud. And they spent a lot of time together. I love the way she represents the eyeglasses here and this idea of vision. And Beata Rank became one of her best friends, also an analyst, a child analyst. The Ranks split up, but Beata really was someone that she corresponded with throughout World War II, and she would send her money. She came to the U.S. She was based in Boston and was part of founding the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute. So through Beata and other clients, she had many Jewish American clients. She became well known in the US. The Menorah Journal was a journal with a Jewish readership in the US in the early to mid 20th century, and her work was regularly reproduced in that. So many of these clients during the war years were writing to her and, wanting to help her. She came to the US for the first time in 1929. She visited New York, Chicago, and other places. Helena Rubinstein collected her work and exhibited it in her stores in New York and in Chicago. And you see her portraits of modern women being promoted to women clients. And throughout the 20s and 30s, she just became known all over the world, really, with prominent exhibitions and galleries, Parisian salons. And at the same time, she's building up her reputation in Palestine, which really didn't have an art world at this time, very emerging one. And here she's has a first exhibit in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art in 1935. And this was a museum that she actually helped found. And this was another area where I felt she had not been credited appropriately in the literature. But I found evidence of her in organizing meetings and on a committee to really decide where this museum should be. It was actually first in the home of the mayor of Tel Aviv, Mayor Dizengoff. So she was part of getting it opened, and she displayed her portraits of prominent Jews from Palestine at that time. Bialik was known as the father of Hebrew poetry. Reuven Rubin, Hannah Rovina, known as the first lady of Hebrew theater, the Habima Theater, and the lower right is Zev Rector, an architect friend who she actually commissioned to design a second home for her adjacent to the first one. So during the occupation, several propagandist exhibitions opened in Paris that officially sanctioned anti-Semitism. And the Vichy government and Institute on Studies on Jewish Questions opened this exhibit called Le Juif et la France, the Jew and France, at the Palais Berlitz in September of 1941. And it featured this statue that I'm showing you here on the right by Charles Perron, a French artist, 30-foot high, France liberating itself from the Jews. This monumental sculpture dominated the rotunda of this exhibit. Now, I don't have evidence that Orloff saw this, but she very well may have, and this is what it was like. I mean, imagine now what I've told you about her as a sculptor, very interested in motherhood, exhibiting all over Paris, and something like this opens, and you see this classical depiction of a young, muscular woman holding her child up in one arm, and she's fending off these two repulsive older Jewish male figures using her knees and her free hand. And this piece really speaks to the Nazi appropriation of caricatures. You have Shylock, the Venetian Jewish money-lending protagonist from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. And this would have been reproduced. So it would have been known, this, very difficult image of the Jewish body. And this exhibition was organized and funded by the propaganda arm of the German military administration in France. And there was actually a film version of it that came out in French cinemas in 1941. So during the occupation, she was really, stuck at home. She had actually made a second trip to the US in 1939 as Nazism intensified. And in New York, her friends were saying, don't go back, don't go back to Paris, it's too dangerous. But her son was back at home, and there was no way that she would, be separated from him during this, scary time politically. So she and her son were among the first to register as Jews with the Vichy collaborators. And she honestly believed she was safe. She was a French citizen. She'd been awarded the Legion of Honor in 1926. So she, articulated that she felt of all people, she would be safe because of her reputation. So she's prohibited from selling her work, exhibiting at a certain point, and really feeling stuck in isolation. She started creating, as I described earlier, these sculptures de poche, thinking I'm going to need to leave, I'm going to need to bring some work with me. This grasshopper in the center, much larger than life, has both biblical and political resonance. Throughout the Old Testament, the grasshoppers transform into migratory locusts that represent God's armies, also protectors of the Jewish people. And of course, the Nazis appropriated the locust as part of their own anti-Semitic propaganda, which likened Jews to undesirable insects and animals. And you see the ostrich as well. She described just feeling trapped like an ostrich in her home. Chaim Soutine on the left was a close friend at this time, and she talked about how they would get together and listen to the radio, try to the Allied forces in her home. Here they're dressed up in costume. So she's trying to, keep her community going, but really feeling stifled professionally. She made multiple attempts to leave Paris during the war years by car with different friends. And of course, she has this son who is, I didn't mention earlier, shortly after her husband died, her son contracted polio. So not only was she a single mother supporting a young child, but of a disabled child. So he walked. His name was Ellie. He went by Didi was his nickname, and he was able to walk, but with great difficulty, using a cane. And so she had to figure out a way to get the two of them out that was, possible for him. Ultimately, they got false papers. They split up within Paris. So the foundry where she cast her sculptures initially was run by a man named Roudier. And he apparently knew that her name was on the list for the Veldiv roundup. And so she was warned that she needed to leave right away. And so the two of them separated in Paris. and took different trains to different locations and ultimately met up first in Lyon and then in Grenoble. But because of his condition, he had partial paralysis and he would get like muscle spasms. They had to figure out a way to get out that would be possible for him. And so they decided to go to Geneva. They had some contacts there. And she ended up meeting up with a colleague named Georges Carr, who was also Jewish, a Czech artist who had been working in Paris. And they identified a passeur, someone who could help them, cross the Alps, a man named Louis Jacques, who was known to be very helpful. And there was an area, which I'm showing you here, the map, where they crossed that was known to be, not as challenging physically in terms of climbing. This was in a village called Archamps, right on the border of France and Switzerland. So I went to Geneva and did this research and learned, exactly where they crossed and what time. And the sister of Walter Benjamin apparently crossed like right after them in the same place with another group. So they made it into Switzerland, and in the book I go into great detail. I was able to uncover some documents that describe just literally like crossing a river in the middle of the night, knowing exactly when the guard took his break. And Orloff has a sack, with her life belongings. She has black and white photographs of her work because she wants to show that she has a professional identity when she gets to the other side, and temporarily loses the sack in the river. Can you imagine? And then finds it and has to dry out all her papers. And it's mid-December, so it's freezing cold. And she's got a handicapped young adult son with her and this friend. So exceedingly difficult conditions of, surviving and, not knowing if the Swiss would accept her. So they ended up first in a camp in Switzerland, and Orloff had to prove that she was an artist. She had, fortunately, these documents that she brought and was released into Geneva, where she had contacts in the art world that could help set her up initially in an apartment and even with a place to work. So you see her there actually in a studio. Now, Georges Carr, this is a self-portrait on the left that he made in Paris, and this is Orloff's bust of him. There were many letters between Carr and Orloff in Switzerland. So he had a sister in Zurich, which is where he went, and he did not get released from these Swiss work camps so quickly. So he's writing to her from these camps under difficult conditions, and he suffered different health problems. This is a drawing that he made that's in the Yad Vashem collection of people he encountered, a mother and children, during the war. And his letters really have a tone of just desperation, things that he lost during their crossing. He lost a coat, he lost like an umbrella. And he literally posts ads in Swiss papers, like looking for these missing items, and just the desperation that people felt, wanting to have their belongings and their pride and their sense of identity. And ultimately, it's very sad, he took his life. Right before the end of the war, he learned that his brother and his brother's family had perished in the Holocaust, and he just, really could not handle all the devastation. And he took his life in Geneva. He was getting ready to go back to France. His wife was not Jewish, and he was getting ready to reunite when this happened. And Chana is the one who found him and had to break the news. And she actually made So it was the common thing to do at the time to make a death mask. She made a mask, not the work I'm showing you here, but of his face. And just the incredible perseverance of this woman. Before she went back to Paris, she actually had an exhibition in Geneva at this gallery called the Moose Gallery. And she was friends with this art dealer. They were very supportive of Jewish artists. And even though under Swiss law, she was not allowed to work, to sell her work, I looked at the registry of sales from the gallery, and some of her work sold. So I think there was a way that people helped her. Collectors would, sell her work under their name, probably to, get her income. So she persisted and was incredibly grateful to all the Swiss people that helped her during that time. And they lived under military control. I mentioned she couldn't sell. I found in the Swiss files a letter from her son. So her son was in university at the time, asking the Swiss police for permission for them to take a vacation on a lake in Geneva with the red stamp, no, refusal. So they could not move very easily. Eventually, with a doctor's note, they were able to take a vacation, but it was, they were safe, but they were living really under a tight control. Now, when she came back to France, she found her studio completely pillaged, over 100 works missing, many destroyed, vandalized, partial sculptures. It was Nora Kars, the widow of Georges, who first found the studio like this and wrote to her in detail. So we have these documents about what it was like. And she didn't move back in initially. She had a lot of repairs to do. She made lists of works, and it's unclear whether she made these lists before she fled Paris or after. But she documented all of the missing work and later added the value of the pieces. In terms of her own artistic practice, you see here sketches she did of people returning from concentration camps, returning from there. And this was a piece she did called Le Retour, The Return. And she did not exhibit it initially. She was not comfortable doing this and felt that this was a private work and only showed it later. Here we see more drawings from this period showing just the desperation of these figures. So this was a time where her work changed radically. You can see that surfaces are not so smooth. Obviously, the themes are much heavier. And when she was interviewed, she, talked about just the darkness of, creating art after the Shoah and not really feeling inspired to do so, and how dark it was as an artist to make work about this period. She went on to make numerous monuments in Israel around the founding of the state. Ultimately, she was invited to do a Jubilee exhibition upon the occasion of her 80th birthday in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, and sadly became ill in flight on the way to open the exhibit and passed away shortly after her arrival. And she was so well known and regarded in Israel at that time that she actually lay in state in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. I mean, how many women can you think of who lay in state in their funeral as an artist, no less? So I'm showing you an image of that there. And in terms of the restitution of her work, this is a big subject that we're researching now. So on the left is a statue, a sculpture of her son, Didi, that she created when he was very young after she was widowed, that was one of the missing works that was pillaged by the Nazis. And it showed up at a Christie's auction house in 2008. And the owner claimed to have purchased it the year before with no history or provenance. And the artist's granddaughter said, "Wait, that belongs to us. That's on the list of missing looted work." And it was in limbo at Christie's in storage for decades. And only last year was it returned to the family, and it was put on exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Paris last year. That's what I'm showing you on the left, at the same time that there was a solo exhibition of Orloff's work at the Musée Zadkine in Paris. So we're finally seeing public interest in her work revived, wanting to better understand what happened to her, how she persisted through these different difficult chapters of her work. And in terms of her legacy, I think it's really crucial to acknowledge the decades-long struggle of families like hers to recover works and have them returned in order to really evaluate the full arc of an artist's life and work. So I think that's probably a good place to end and take questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paula. This was a very, very full presentation, and I really admire your research and also Chana Orloff, who has shown so much perseverance and strength really throughout her life, and flexibility towards changing outer circumstances. So please, everybody who's listening, post your questions now. Cordula Hahn is saying, and I very much agree to that, what a great pleasure to immerse oneself in the life and works of an artist I was not familiar with. And Ilyana says, I met her in the 1960s in Tel Aviv when he installs this sculpture of a dancer in my parents' home. Yeah, so her family is now both in Paris and both in Israel, or is it the families of her siblings, or is it, what's the story?
Yeah, so someone wrote in, what happened to Didi Orloff? So yeah, so he thrived. He was able to study, and he became an actuary in Paris, and he fell in love with a French woman and got married, Marie, and they had 3 children. And 2 of them are living in Paris in the 2 houses that she built. The daughter, Ariane Tamir, married an Israeli. And so she splits her home in Herzliya and in Paris. And they run a museum out of her home, which you can visit. You can go to their website, and it's the Association, Chana Orloff Association, Atelier Chana Orloff, and they organize tours. They're, excuse me, they're open on the Jour des Patrimoines. They always organize something. And yeah, they were a big part of the 2 exhibitions in Paris last year at the Musée Zadkine and at the Jewish Museum. Now there's a really sad and disturbing update on her family in light of the current war. So her older brother, Zvi Nishri, was one of the founders of the physical culture movement in Palestine and then Israel. He was the first gym teacher at the Hebrew High School in Tel Aviv, and helped to found the Scouts movement in Israel, the Maccabiah Games, all of this sporting events he was a vital part of. And he had many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so one of his grandchildren, his granddaughter, was one of the founders with her husband of Kibbutz Be'eri, which sadly was one of the kibbutz, as we know, that was hit the hardest on October 7th. And I met his great-granddaughter, one of the people who lived there. And she was hosting a large family gathering on October 7th. There were 10 of them, and 3 of them were murdered, and the rest were taken hostage. And the women and children were returned in that moment when all the women and children came back. And there is one young man that is still a hostage. So yeah, it's very just the cyclical nature of, violence and anti-Semitism. Very tragic that it's, hit the family again. And the grandchildren have been very vocal in the return of the hostages. And I was even asked, is there a way that my research could help the family at this time? So yeah. Well, and I should share, this is kind of crazy, but I learned that this relative had actually, who was a hostage, had been reading my book. She was in the middle of reading my book when she was taken hostage. And she found the stories of Chana Orloff and her persistence helpful in thinking, how am I going to endure this? And after she was released, she, asked to have the book to finish it. So I never would have thought, an art historian in San Francisco that who researches French women artists, that my work would have a role in, something like this. So crazy.
That is very crazy. And but I think from, from people like Chana Orloff, who went through persecution and flight and dislocation, and we can learn a lot from them. I mean, that's really the reason why one of the reasons why we do this series and why we're having this conversation, because it's so very relevant, not only to know about these artists, but also to be inspired by their strength and perseverance, and the strength they took in being part of Jewish history in many ways. Yeah, so thank you so much. I think this is a really good point to end this presentation, because yeah, I don't think I think we should all try to be inspired by Chana Orloff and her works. And I do hope that the restitution cases will, be successful, that the family will be able to get the sculptures back that have been stolen from the family, and that as many as possible survived, that they weren't destroyed. So thank you so much, Paula. This was a very enlightening presentation, and I in the follow-up email, I will send a notice about the book, which is now which I can only recommend reading. It's a really good read. Very informative and very deep and very well researched. So thank you. Thank you for putting Chana Orloff on the map with such a thorough research and work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thanks to all of you for spending an hour with me and learning about her story. So I really hope that it inspires you and that you'll check out the book. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Take good care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.